Andrew, thank you very much indeed. I was delighted to have this invitation because Andrew fixed up a fantastic meeting in Oxford in this summer called Persons and Their Brains. And we had 3 days, to be honest, when I was just in heaven. I was like a pig in fertilizer. It was just absolutely brilliant. And we've just had another 3-hour conversation along with Graham Ward, your new Regis Professor of Theology. So I'm very, very glad to be here. And thank you for having me. And yes, indeed, I'm going to talk about neuromania, Darwinitis, and the misrepresentation of humanity. And this is something that's preoccupied me for a long time. I used to drive my tutor in Oxford, Roy Kay, a wonderful man, who was a neurophysiologist. I used to drive him crackers, worrying about the kind of issues that I'm going to trouble you with tonight. To the neurophysiologists present, I apologise. What I'm going to say is of a very general nature. To the philosophers present, I want to apologise because it's also of a very general nature. But I hope I'll hit the spot with the audience at large. It is what I'm going to say is very much based on what I say in this book, which came out in paperback, coincidentally, and is available in all places where truth and enlightenment is valued, e.g. Blackwalls and Broad Street. But I think there's a very important job to be done in the coming decades in developing a clear idea of what we humans are, what image we can form of ourselves in the, to me, the wake of the decline of religious belief. Andrew, I'm sure, would disagree with me on that. But I think this job will be all the harder if we commit ourselves to the wrong ideas. And these are the ideas I'm going to talk about in my talk. My master theme is biologism, the assumption that we humans are essentially animal organisms and are best understood through the biological sciences. This is an idea, of course, of some antiquity, but it currently has unprecedented currency in academe, in the Republic of Letters, and in the popular press. Biologism is founded on 2 pillars of unwisdom, which I've called neuromania and Darwinitis, and I want to offer you a brief definition of each. Neuromania is based on the assumption that human consciousness is identical with neural activity in the human brain. I am my brain, you are your brain. The brain explains every aspect of human awareness and behavior. From this it follows if you want to understand human beings, you must peer into the darkness inside their skulls using neuroscientific techniques for recording brain activity. Now, the neuromaniac's favourite toy is a tool which has made huge contributions to real neuroscience. I used it towards the end of my career as a clinical neuroscientist, namely functional magnetic resonance imaging, an example of which you can see here, and I'm going to return to this example in due course. But alas, it's become a fast-acting solvent of the critical sense. Indeed, it's almost impossible to open a newspaper without an example of a brain scan next to an article, breathless with excitement, reporting that scientists have found the secret of love, of wisdom, or of our sense of beauty. You just expose subjects to the relevant stimuli and see which bits of their brains light up. Neuromania. So let me now turn my attention to the other pillar, Darwinitis. This is an inflamed or pathological version of Darwinism, and it asserts that evolutionary theory explains not only how the organism Homo sapiens arose, of course it does, but also the nature of people like you and me. Evolutionary forces, natural selection, survival advantage explain the origin and purpose of human behavior and human institutions. Everything is forged in and distantly related or otherwise relates to the bloodbath in which genes are shaped by the differential survival of organisms. The processes that produced millipedes were exactly the same as the ones that produced Mozart. In brief, it's the assumption that Darwinism encompasses not only the biological roots of the human organism, of course it does, but the cultural leaves of the human person. Now, you may think this sounds pretty harmless, or better than harmless, a frank acknowledgement of what we are. But I want to look at the consequences of biologism as they're drawn by those few writers who fully acknowledge them. Consider the consequences of neuromania as drawn out by that eminent neuroscientist, brilliant neuroscientist, Colin Blakemore, in his excellent Reith lectures, The Mechanics of Mind, many years ago. The human brain, he says, is a machine which alone accounts for all our actions, our most private thoughts, our beliefs. All our actions are the products of the activity of our brains. It makes no sense in scientific terms, implicitly, therefore, makes no sense in any terms, to try to distinguish sharply between acts that result from conscious attention and those that result from our reflexes or are caused by disease or damage to the brain. Of course, this has huge implications for any idea we might have that we're free. If we're identical with our brains, or with certain neural discharges in them, we must be just as unfree when we're conscious as when we're unconscious. And many have drawn this conclusion and asserted that free will is an illusion. If we're in the grip of biological forces, which ultimately boil down to physical forces, we cannot be even aware of the true reasons for our actions. Indeed, there aren't reasons for actions. We're not agents at all. We're absorbed into nature, natural parts of a natural world, which, given that living matter is ultimately regulated by the laws of matter, period, we are material parts of the material world, wired into the forces of physical nature just as much as any pebble. And it's this that makes it rather extraordinary that so many in the humanities, which one might expect will be a bulwark against scientism, should have embraced neuroscience and evolutionary theory as the guide to their own disciplines with such enthusiasm. Collaboration rather than resistance seems to be in the watchword. They have listened to the words of the once despised prophet, E.O. Wilson, who argued that the humanities, ranging from philosophy and history to moral reasoning, comparative religion, and interpretation of the arts, will draw closer to the sciences and partly fuse with them, and you can bet your bottom dollar that the terms on which the fusion takes place are dictated by science. For example, there is a flourishing pseudo-discipline of neuroaesthetics, which explains both creativity and aesthetic pleasure in terms of activity in certain parts of the brain. Brain tingles is all. This propensity for brain tingles has been implanted in us by evolution, hence Darwinian aesthetics. Evolution which makes sure that we tingle to the right kinds of things, for example, symmetrical faces, or pictures of landscapes loaded with food. Neurolaw aims to replace the untidy processes of the legal system with a biological justice rooted in an understanding of the neural causes of action. Neuroeconomics can explain why we buy things we don't need, or we shouldn't buy, by looking at the balance between the want-it centre in the amygdaloid body and the wait until you can afford it centre in the frontal lobes. Those toxic subprime mortgages were in fact neurotoxic. Conspicuous consumption and our trillion-pound debts are due to our desire to advertise our genetic health. Neuropoliticians tell us we should look beyond the ideologies of the right and left to an understanding of the rivalry between the left and right hemispheres. Neurotheologians look for God spots in the brain where religious experiences and beliefs are located. The evolutionary theorists of religion tell us that the God spot has been implanted in our brains because religion, believe it or not, promotes solidarity and inclusive fitness. Ethics is also rooted in the replicative imperative of the selfish gene. Even altruism or religious belief can be explained in evolutionary terms by employing the notion of inclusive fitness. Inclusive fitness is the sum of the organism's classical fitness, how many of its own offspring it produces and supports, and the number of equivalents of its own offspring that it can add to the population by supporting or cooperating with others, by being nice. Now, it wouldn't take very long to expose the fallacies that are the foundation stones of all these pseudo-disciplines, but there's not enough time in the present talk to do so. But never mind, it's all there in the book. The point for the present is that they are symptoms of a biologistic view of mankind, and this is what I want to talk about. Now, the fact that such a view has undesirable consequences, of course, should not itself cut any ice. Just because you don't like something doesn't make it untrue. There's only an accidental connection between the palatable and the true. I find it rather unpalatable to think I'm going to die one day, but this doesn't prove that I'm immortal. Yuck is not an argument. So I owe it to you to focus on the fundamental errors of neuromania and Darwinitis. And let me start with neuromania. I want to look briefly at the logical errors behind neuromania, then talk about current limitations of neuroscience that make many claims premature, to put it mildly, and finally about the fundamental barriers to neural explanations of consciousness that would remain even if the current limitations of the science were overcome. First, the central muddle. As a clinical neuroscientist for many years, I'm fully aware that to live a human life requires a brain in some kind of working order. It doesn't follow from this, however, that living a human life is being a brain in some kind of working order. Neuroscience reveals some of the most important necessary conditions of behavior and awareness. What it doesn't do is to provide a satisfactory account of the sufficient conditions of awareness and behavior, particularly human awareness and human behavior. And the mistaken idea that it does is neuromania. So much for the logical error. But let me now move to the empirical problems and illustrate them with two very much discussed studies, which seem to confirm to some that even our most complex feelings, emotions and activities are reducible to brain events, and that even when we feel we are acting voluntarily, it's our brains that are calling the shots. I want to focus on Semir Zeki and Andrea Bartel's study of the neurobiology of love, and secondly, Benjamin Libet's studies of voluntary motor activity. First, Semir Zeki and Andrea Bartel's claim that they've discovered the Centre for Romantic Love. They reported this in a paper published in 2001, which was widely covered in the press. How did they discover where romantic love was in the brain? Well, they asked their subjects to look at the photograph of a face of someone with whom they were deeply in love, and then at those of three friends. By subtracting the activity the brain recorded when the subjects looked at their friends from that which was seen when they looked at their lovers, they claimed to be able to demonstrate the distinctive brain activity associated with love, brackets, romantic, unbrackets. They've also done studies on love, brackets, maternal, unbrackets, and love, brackets, unconditional, unbrackets. But here for love, brackets, romantic, unbrackets, here it is. It's in the medial insula and the anterior cingulate cortex and subcortically in the caudate nucleus and the putamen. And for those of you who are romantics, you'll be glad to know it was all bilaterally. And here it is in pictures. Now this should awaken wonder, not that love could be tucked away in such a small space, but how could anyone fail to see the fallacies in this experimental design? Now there are many methodological problems, and I'd be happy to discuss that with the neuroscientists in the audience, but the most striking, of course, is the grotesque reduction of the state in question. Love, ladies and gentlemen, is not like a response to simple stimulus, such as a picture. It's not even a single enduring state, like being cold. It is a many-splendid, and if you read the books, a many-miseried thing. As anyone who's been in love, or read about it in a craning book, will know that it includes many things. Here are a few. Not feeling in love at that moment. Hunger for, or simulated indifference to, or delight over the beloved. Wanting to be kind to, wanting to impress the special other, worrying over the logistics of meetings, lust, bit of biology there, or surprise, joy, guilt, anger, jealousy, imagining conversations, events, speculating what the loved one is doing and feeling, all 12 volumes of À la recherche Tom Perdue, and so on. To construe this as the property of one organ, one ancient organ forged in the Pleistocene era, or indeed as part of an organ, or indeed of an organism, responding to a stimulus, notwithstanding all the physiological components of love. It's not yet 9 o'clock, so I won't spell them out, and the biological roots of some aspects of it belongs to a self. Love belongs to a self relating to a community of minds, of which more presently. The neuralization of love requires its prior reduction to the response to something like a simple, repeatable stimulus. And this is deeply connected with the project of stuffing something whose theatre is the community of selves, operating in the human world, back into the intracranial darkness, into the standalone brain. You will be relieved to know that even the neuroscience community is starting to feel a bit uneasy about the simplistic identification of activities in parts of the brain, a fine giblet, but still a giblet, with human feelings and propensities to behavior. In a paper, provocative, entitled originally Voodoo Correlations in Social Neuroscience, Ed Vowles and Harold Pashler, and Harold Pashler is a serious psychologist. He's the editor of the 4 volumes of the textbook of physiological psychology. They found flaws with the localizations observed in such studies. And again, I'd be happy to discuss the methodological problems with these studies. But it's the metaphysical problems I'm interested in. Now, the process of simplification, to prepare a piece of our humanity to be stuffed back into a bit of the brain, is evident in my second example. A famous set of experiments carried out by the neurophysiologist Benjamin Libet in the 1980s and repeated and refined many times since, described by the neurophysiologist Patrick Haggard as one of the philosophically most challenging studies in modern scientific psychology. These studies have been twice discussed on the Today programme, which indicates how far they've penetrated the collective consciousness. These studies, to some, appear to show that our brain makes decisions to act before our conscious mind is aware of them. So they're not really our decisions at all. In a typical experiment, Libet subjects are instructed to make a simple movement, to bend their right wrist or the fingers of their right hand, in their own time, so it's a voluntary movement. They're not responding to command. Using electroencephalography, or brainwave recording, the experimenter records a particular activity in the brain that indicates a readiness to move. This is the so-called readiness potential, the Bereitschaft potential, which was first described by Kornhuber in the 1960s. And it's seen in the part of the cerebral cortex most closely associated with voluntary movement. Libet also asked his subjects to recall the position of a spot revolving around a clock face in order to determine the time when they were first aware of their urge or intention to make a movement. To his surprise, he found that the readiness potential occurred a consistent third of a second before the time at which the subjects reported being aware of a decision to move. So Libet concluded from this that the brain, not the subject, not the person, decided to initiate, or at least to prepare to initiate the act before there was any reportable subjective awareness of a decision having been made. Put more simply, the cerebral accompaniments of our actions seem to occur before our conscious awareness of deciding to perform them. More recently, John Dillon Hayes and his colleagues carried out studies in which a succession of letters were displayed on a screen. Then subjects were asked to press a left or a right button, voluntary action, at a moment of their own choosing, and at the same time to note the letter which had been being displayed on the screen at the time they felt they were making a decision to press the button. The letter was a time marker. Two regions that lit up in the brain predicted the subject's choice of the left or the right button. Remarkably, the regions in question lit up a full 5 seconds before the individual was aware of having made a choice. Moreover, there were other areas in the frontal cortex, traditionally ascribed executive powers, that were active no less than 7 seconds before awareness of the decision. And indeed, if the delay in the response of the scanner detecting the activity was accounted for, the interval increased to 10 seconds. From this, the authors concluded that there is a network of high-level control areas that begins to prepare an upcoming decision long before it enters awareness. It looks like we don't know what we're doing until we've found we've done it. And from these and many other experiments, Daniel Wegner has concluded that the only connection between willing and acting is that both come from the same unconscious source. Hold on a moment. The action the subjects were asked to perform was the simplest imaginable, a flexing of the wrist, a mere movement. That movement, however, was itself only a minute part of a long sequence of movements amounting to a large-scale action, which could be described as taking part in Dr. Libet's experiment. This large-scale action began at least as far back as getting up in the morning to visit Dr. Libet's laboratory, after perhaps setting the alarm the night before to make sure that one wasn't late. It involved consenting to take part in an experiment whose nature and purpose and safety was fully understood. And it required, among many other things, listening to and understanding and agreeing to the instructions that were received about moving one's wrist, and then deciding to flex the wrist. In other words, the immediate prior intention, the psychological event timed by Libet, was not the whole story of the action, only a tiny part of it. It was preceded by many others that were minutes, hours, perhaps days before the action. So the real story is not just the flexing of the wrist, but one of a sustained and complex resolve being maintained over a very long time. This resolve including many large items of behavior, getting on and off buses to get to the laboratory, looking for the laboratory, getting cross about how badly signposted it was, cancelling or declining other commitments so as to be free to attend the lab, and so on. And of course, all of these had many thousands of motor components, much greater than merely flexing the wrist. And once this is appreciated, then the temporal relation between the last step, the wrist flexing, and the readiness potential seen in the lab, becomes entirely unimportant. The decision to participate in the experiment, which alone gave the wrist flexion its meaning, began not milliseconds, seconds or minutes, but hours before the wrist was flexed. The flexing of the wrist was just the last component of an action called taking part in Dr. Libet's experiment, which would itself be part of a greater intentional whole, such as wanting to please Dr. Libet, or indeed wanting to help those clever scientists understand the brain, as it might one day assist doctors to treat my child's brain injury more effectively. What Libet's experiment illustrates is not that we don't have freedom, but how the neuromaniac case against freedom, seemingly demonstrating that we are our brains and our brains are calling the shots, how this case against freedom is rooted in a very distorted conception of what constitutes an action in everyday life. If you want to make voluntary actions seem involuntary, the first thing to do is to strip away their context. You remove the self from which they originate, the nexus of meanings that is the world to which they are addressed, and then effectively you break them down into their physical elements. And this gets you well on the way to eliminating the difference between a twitch and a deliberate action, and make an action seem as if it could be explained by a burst of nerve impulses embedded in an impersonal neural reality, rather than belonging to a first-person world where behavior is not atomic but interconnected. The locus of free will is a field of intention, rooted in a self and its world, and that extends beyond anything that can be observed in a neuroscience laboratory. Well, so much for the empirical evidence that seems to support the assumption that consciousness boils down to neuroactivity. But of course, this is an assumption. It's not something that has been discovered by empirical observation. And I want to subject this assumption directly to criticism. And my critique will be based upon this inescapable fact. When we're talking about the brain, we're talking about a piece of matter subject to the laws of physics. And this is what Daniel Dennett, a leading proponent of neuromania, has pointed out. What does Dennett say? There's only one stuff, namely matter, the physical stuff of physics, chemistry, and physiology. And the mind is somehow, nothing but a physical phenomenon. In short, the mind is the brain. And this is the key bit. We can, in principle, he says, account for every mental phenomenon using the same physical principles, laws, and raw materials that suffice to explain radioactivity, continental drift, photosynthesis, reproduction, nutrition, and growth. Well, if we keep this in mind, we have enough ammunition to demonstrate the necessary failure of neuroscientific accounts of human consciousness and conscious behavior. I'm going to focus on something very basic. My argument is that we have serious problems understanding the relationship with the brain and even ground floor consciousness. It's daft to look to brain science to cast light on the upper stories of human consciousness, on love, on wisdom, and on our sense of beauty. And that's why I'm going to focus on the basic level. And my necessity to take those of you who are non-philosophers through some philosophical arguments which may seem a bit hard-going. So blame your suffering, those who are non-philosophers, in the next 5 or 10 minutes or so on the neuromaniacs. It's not my fault, it's theirs. So let's begin on the ground floor with perception, as it is experienced in humans. The explicit sense of being aware of something that is other than oneself. Consider this person's awareness of the glass in front of her. The standard account says that her perception of the glass is the result of the light reflecting from the glass, entering her eyes, and triggering activity in her visual pathways. There is an unbroken causal chain connecting the glass with neural activity in the brain. This chain of causes and effects is entirely compatible with physical science, all the things that Dennett was talking about. Unfortunately for neuromania, the inward causal path does not deliver her awareness of the glass as an item explicitly separate from there, as over there with respect to herself, who is over here. There's nothing in the activity in the visual cortex, nerve impulses that are material events in a material object, which would make the activity be about the thing that she sees, about something other than herself. And there's nothing new about this. Intentionality is something that was very much highlighted by the Stoic philosophers, medieval philosophers, and more recently by the phenomenologists, beginning with Franz Brentano. The inward causal chain explains how the light gets into her brain, but not how this results in a gaze that looks out. In other words, we have something fundamental that's left unexplained, what the philosophers call intentionality, that makes the activity in the visual cortex be about the glass. Intentionality, from the standpoint of someone like DLitt, is utterly mysterious, not the least because it seems to point in a sort of metaphorical sense in the opposite direction to causality, in the opposite direction to the causal chain that passes into the visual cortex, through the visual cortex to other parts of the cortex, and eventually to those parts of the brain that are associated with motor activity. Importantly, intentionality is not feedback or reverse causation. Rather, it's something that opens up an otherwise causally closed world and makes it something, ultimately, that an agent can operate on from a virtual outside. If neuromania were true, my perception of the glass would require the neural activity in the visual cortex to reach, as it were, causally upstream to the events that cause that neural activity. This is inexplicable in material DLitt terms, and crucially for my argument, it is most explicitly developed in human perception. It's human beings who are embodied subjects that face objects that they're aware of as being separate and different from themselves. And this is where we have to begin when we're trying to understand human consciousness. The neural theory of consciousness cannot deal with the essentially relational aspect of awareness, of consciousness, for which a single player, neural activity, is not enough. Intentionality, which cannot be ascribed to material events such as nerve impulses, is of the utmost significance. Suffice it to say that it creates the possibility of an ever-widening gap between the conscious individual and the material world. And this possibility is what is realized in humans, who are not simply organisms, but embodied subjects. Now, focusing on intentionality brings us to the heart of the trouble that the neural theory of perception and higher consciousness is in. Namely, its central claim that the material interaction between two objects, say the brain and a glass, will cause one object, the glass, to appear to or in the other, the brain. The counter-causal direction of intentionality not only shows that this can't be accommodated in physical science, and physical science is the ultimate parent of neuroscience, but that appearance is not something that the material world, as seen through science, a nexus of causation affords. The brain, being a piece of matter, must be person-free. No wonder neuroscience can't find the self or the conscious agent in the brain, and this is true not only in the fundamental sense that I've just highlighted, but at a less fundamental and no less important sense. Persons or selves have two features which can't be captured in neural terms: unity in multiplicity and temporal depth. And I want to touch briefly on both of these. Firstly, unity in multiplicity. At this moment, I'm aware of a multitude of experiences, sensations, perceptions, memories, thoughts, emotions. I'm conscious of them, I'm co-conscious of them. They are, that is to say, integrated into a unity of sorts. And it's difficult to see how this integration is possible, since neurophysiology assigns them to spatially different parts of the brain. Aspects of consciousness, we are to believe, are kept very tidily apart. The pathways for perception are separate from those from emotion, which are separate from those from memory, which are separate from those from motivation, which are separate from those for judgment, and so on and so forth. Within perception, vision, hearing, and smell have different pathways and destinations. And within, say, visual perception, different parts of the brain are supposed to be responsible for receiving the colour, the shape, the distance, the classification, the purpose, and the emotional significance of seen objects. When, however, I see my red hat on the table over there, I see that someone's squashed it, and I feel crossed about it, and I hear you laughing, and I recognise the laughter as yours, and I'm upset, and I notice the taxi I've ordered has arrived so I can catch the train, that I'm aware that I must not miss. Many things that are kept apart must somehow be brought together. There is no model of synthesis in this brain, because not only are they brought together, but they are still kept apart, so I can attend to them separately. This is the so-called binding problem. Numerous solutions have been offered. I'm happy to discuss them in question time, but none of them works. Well, what of neurological explanation of the other distinctive feature of subjectivity? Temporal depth. We're aware of a past, our own past, and the shared past, the ultimate collective shared past that is history. And we reach into a future, our own future, and a timetabled future. But let me just focus on the past. There are many physiological accounts of memory, but they have one thing in common. They see memory as a cerebral deposit. Memory is, to use a very slippery term, stored as an effect on the brain, expressed in its altered reactivity. This has been demonstrated to the satisfaction of many neurophysiologists and cognitive neuroscientists in creatures as disparate as apes, chick embryos, and fruit flies. Some of the most justly lauded work on memory, which won Eric Kandel his 2000 Nobel Prize, has been on the sea slug. Unfortunately, the sea slug doesn't share many aspects of memory that we do. As far as I know, sea slugs do not have a semantic memory of facts. They have no explicit memory of events that they locate in their past. No autobiographical memories located in their own past. No explicit sense of time, of the past, even less of a collective past. They don't gather together to have seminars on the history of sea sluggery. No active recall. They don't rack their meagre allocation of 20,000 neurons to try and recall something. Even less do they have nostalgia for the time before they met Eric Kandel and he did the horrible experiments on them. Now, the failure of neurophysiological accounts of memory is a theme for a talk in itself, but I want to cut to the chase. A putative neural account of memory can't deal with the difference between, say, perceptions and memories because there is no past tense, or indeed future tense, or indeed present tense in the material world. As Einstein said, physicists know that the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. I have to say I wince when he said that. It was in a letter to the widow of his oldest friend. He was sort of trying to cheer her up. Tenses are not present in the material world. But there are many more philosophical problems with neuromania, but that is enough, I hope, to convince you of the groundlessness of the assumption that neural activity is identical with consciousness, so that if you want to understand us, you need to look to brain science. Now, once we've established that mind and brain activity are not identical, then we've also pulled the rug from beneath Darwinitis, since the mind ceases to be something that is co-evolved with the brain. But Darwinitis deserves some attention of its own because it's such a dominant presence in our thinking about ourselves. So I will talk about it briefly. The notion that we are just animals and that the differences between human life in the library or the operating theatre and animal life in the jungle or the savannah are more apparent than real. At most, the matter's degree rather than kind. These are dominant ideas. It's a mistake to combat this view by appealing to high-end activities such as composing symphonies or fretting over transfinite numbers. No, the differences between ourselves and beasts are wall to wall, and they relate as much to those things that seem to be mirrored in animal behavior as to those in which we are obviously unique. For we humans take the biological givens and transform them out of all recognition. And I want to illustrate this with a couple of fairly homely examples. Feeding behavior and learning behavior. First, feeding. Suppose you invite me out for a meal. Having learned you've just taken on a big loan for a house, I choose the cheapest items on the menu and falsely declare that I'm full after the main course, so as to spare you the expense of a pudding. I know you're in the condition of being haunted by your own house. A chimpanzee gives a banana to another chimpanzee who eats it. Now, Darwinitics would like to say that both the chimp and I are doing very similar things. We're both exhibiting feeding behavior. This identity description, however, I hope you agree, obscures huge differences between the chimp's behavior and mine. Anyone who is acquainted with the most routine dinner table, the product of a vast number of deliberate actions on the part of those sitting round it, will be on their guard when they hear the phrase feeding behavior applied to both humans and beasts. An ordinary meal is the end point of a long journey away from biology. Cooking, eating regulated by the clock and the calendar, the complex structure of meals and the grammar of what goes with what, the ritualistic, symbolic and celebratory aspects of eating, the multitude of items of tableware that have come from near and far, the journeys taken by the food to the table, the journeys undertaken by those who gather around the table, and the use of money as an all-purpose commodity to purchase food. These are but a few of the ways in which human dining is distanced from animal eating. These are all increasingly sophisticated aspects of man, the animal who does things explicitly, and whose natural medium is a community of minds extending geographically across the globe and historically into the cumulative consciousness of the race. The laid and laden table draws on 4 quarters of the earth and great tracts of past and present human consciousness. And take learning behavior. Here's a fairly ordinary example. I decide to improve my career prospects by signing up for a degree course, which begins next year. But I have a small child. I therefore do more babysitting this year in order to stockpile some tokens for next year. Daisy the cow bumps into electric wire and henceforth avoids that place, having had her bottom fried. It could be said that both Daisy and I have been exhibiting learning behaviour, but again I think we'll agree that the difference between the two forms of behaviour is greater than the similarities. And the example I've given illustrates something important and unique about human learning. Human learning is not something that merely happens, it's done and it's organised. And this is connected with the fact that humans practice skills and memorisation, while animals do not. What's more, animals don't teach their young, not at least outside of Disneyland. Human learning is a collective exercise and is mediated by institutions, and so on and so forth. What's more, learning for us humans is part of a narrative of a life that is led, rather than a life that is merely organically lived. There's something very big behind all this. It's called the human world. And this world is woven out of shared attention, out of 1 trillion cognitive handshakes. It's a semiosphere, a realm of signs and meanings quite remote from the biosphere in which all other sentient beings live and have their being. Most of our actions in daily life, however concrete, typically make sense only with respect to frameworks of which we are conscious, which incorporate many layers of abstraction. None of these frames of reference has any counterpart in the life of beasts. This world, with its frameworks of understanding, transcends the organism Homo sapiens as it was delivered by Darwinian processors hundreds of thousands of years ago. These hundreds of thousands of years are the measure of how far Darwinitis, which sees us simply as other primates, are out of date. We have, as it were, stepped outside of our organic body into a domain where things are made explicit. In that domain, uniquely, we guide, justify, and excuse our behaviour according to general and abstract principles. We create cities, laws, and institutions. We entertain theories about our own nature and about the world. We frame our individual lives within a shared history. And some of us systematically inquire into the order of things and the patterns of causation and physical laws that seem to underpin that order. Most importantly, we are aware of norms. Now, nature is not gormless, certainly, but it's normless. These phenomena, profound and complex and pervasive though they are mere surface manifestations or symptoms of something even more profound, complex and pervasive. That we are explicit animals who lead our lives, living out shared and individual narratives rather than merely living them, who are conscious of ourselves, of others and the material world, and of its intrinsic existence and properties in the way that no animal is conscious. V.S. Ramachandran, a distinguished neuroscientist, surely spoke truly when he asserted that humanity transcends apehood to the same degree by which life transcends mundane chemistry and physics. This seems so blindingly obvious, it's difficult to see why so many people so stubbornly insist on overlooking what is in front of their noses, and perhaps we might discuss this in question and answer time. But it is time, you'll be glad to learn, for me to come to start winding up. I've addressed what I think is one of the most widely received ideas of our time, namely that biology is the key to human nature, that we are best understood as largely unconscious or programmed organisms operating in a natural world rather than as conscious agents acting in a uniquely human one. The consequences of biologism are, if followed, appalling. The gap between human and non-human animals is elided. Even higher level awareness is reduced to the properties of living matter, concerned only with continuation through reproduction and repair. With the identification of the human mind with the functioning of the organic brain, the assumption of a fundamental difference between human actions and other events in the material world, between, say, your coming to this event and the chemotaxis of a single-celled organism towards nutrients, or the fall of a stone, seems shaky. The impersonal, unbreakable laws of the physical world, the blind watchmakers that Richard Dawkins correctly identified as the drivers to the evolutionary process, the blind watchmakers encroach upon, engulf, and digest our humanity. Biologism is propped up by these two pillars of unwisdom, Neuromania and Darwinitis, and I hope you're sufficiently persuaded by my arguments to agree that this is the most appropriate place. Now, you may think that no one takes them serious enough to follow their conclusions. Well, if this was so, then they would still be important as obstacles to our trying to understand our nature in a way that doesn't involve supernatural explanations. For me, an atheist but also a humanist, naturalistic or biologistic accounts are as unsatisfactory as supernatural ones. And I think a great and exciting challenge confronts us in trying to make sense of ourselves, and Neuromania and Darwinitis just get in the way. What's more, Neuromania and Darwinitis may be worse than merely obstructive, stopping us even starting to think. They may even be dangerous. For example, John Gray, 50 Shades of John Gray, a hugely acclaimed celebrity misanthrope and a ferocious anti-humanist, has argued in his best-selling Straw Dogs and dozens of books since then that Darwin has demonstrated that we're not particularly special. Human life has no more meaning than that of a slime mould. Man is only one of many species and not obviously worth preserving. Speak for yourself, mate. Ladies and gentlemen, I sometimes think that ideas have consequences. Abstract arguments may begin by looking like harmless puppies, but they may grow up to be something quite else. And that's why I do believe that we need those of us who disagree with Neuromania and Darwinitis to take it seriously and criticize it. Anyway, it's time, you'll be glad to learn, for me to start to wind up. As the late, great Humphrey Lyttelton might have put it, I hear the tortoise of time exploding in the microwave of eternity. Suffice it to say that those who try to explain love, conscience, human institutions by describing what they find when they peer into the brain are rather like someone who applies a stethoscope to this item, an acorn, and hopes to hear the rustling of the breezes in the forest. Neuromaniacs and Darwinitis are trying to find the community of minds forged from 1 trillion cognitive handshakes in bits of the standalone brain, lighting up in the intracranial darkness. Even if you start from the brain, which may not be the worst place to start, you have to leave the brain behind when you're talking about social phenomena that are established in and supported by what Donald Davidson called the community of minds. I ought to end by emphasizing that I have no problem with biology. I'm a doctor whose treatments depended on biological science. I spent 30 or more years adding my minute grains of truth to the great monument that is clinical neuroscience. Nor do I have a religious agenda. I'm an atheist humanist. Nor am I crazy enough to question Darwin's theory of evolution. I'm not a creationist nutter. And finally, by the way, I'm not a dualist, and I don't mind if people call me a racist, a fascist, an imperialist, but I really take exception if they call me a dualist. All of those things are untrue. So I don't think of the mind as being like a ghost in a meat machine. But this gives me the cue for a final thought from the philosopher Gilbert Ryle in his classic The Philosophy of Mind. Man need not be degraded to machine by being denied to be a ghost in a machine. He might, after all, be a sort of animal, namely a higher mammal, that has yet to be ventured the hazardous leap to the hypothesis that perhaps he is man. And I think it's time we took that hazardous leap. So there you are. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention, or at least for so courteously simulating it. Thank you.
As always, Roy. We have about half an hour for questions. I'm going to invite my colleague, Ignatius, to come around with a microphone. If you want your voice recorded, please wait until the microphone comes to you, and then we get some kind of continuity. Thank you very much. So, questions?
Yes. You don't mention, I'm, as you know, a philosopher, professionally, if not in a high sense, but and I have a lot of sympathy. I mean, I ever since my PhD thesis, all that those years ago, was trying to prove that we have free will. And ever since then, I've argued for taking consciousness seriously. You don't mention what you might have called the third pillar of unwisdom, which is the computer analogy.
Yeah.
And functionalism, which is a very important philosophical theory, which is going the way you don't like. which lives on the computer analogy. And that does attempt to explain intentionality. In fact, a lot of philosophers think that explaining intentionality is the easy problem, what they call the easy problem, and explaining consciousness is the difficult problem, so those were two entirely different things. The other thing is, while I agree that there's a huge difference between human life and animal life, there's a certain danger, it seems to me, which one could name a few philosophers who I think who fall into this, of thinking that by emphasizing the difference between human life and animal life, you have thereby explained intentionality in terms of the possession of concepts and language and so forth. But it seems to me that the problem of intentionality arises with, certainly with higher animals, perception, for example. I mean, there is a sense in which an animal will be aware of an object as other than itself. I mean, if it wants to scratch itself, it doesn't scratch the chair in front of it. Well, they do scratch the chairs, of course, but not. So there is a certain danger there that, I mean, as you said, I mean that somehow they're kicking away the acorn, so to speak. I mean, they're not recognizing that the problem of consciousness and intentionality arises with tortoises in a very simple form. But that doesn't mean to say that human beings are like tortoises.
Can I deal with your points in reverse order? And thank you. It seems to me that clearly animals are sentient. And I have no doubt about that. And by the way, don't think my distancing myself from the animal kingdom gives me permission to, kick a dog. I do feel they are capable of suffering, and we have a moral responsibility to treat them in such a way that we do not gratuitously inflict suffering on them. Having said that, I had enjoyed a very nice meal of meat this evening. The issue of intentionality is a very interesting one, isn't it? And I mean, in particular, DLitt ran with the idea of intentionality and thought it was something we simply ascribed to others in order to simplify our understanding, which is nonsense, because why on earth would you simplify understanding of the behavior of other persons by ascribing intentionality? If it was something purely ascribed, then how on earth would it actually deliver anything useful? But I have written a book critiquing the computational theory of mind, and I think it's one of, luckily it's dying, that's why I didn't mention it. You don't kick a dead man when it's down, as you were, but or you might spit on its grave when you've got a sort of spare moment. But it just seems to me that the notion of intentionality, I mean, dealing with one of the points in your question, is do non-human creatures have intentionality? And I think you've got to, in order to have full-blown intentionality, you have to have a full sense of being an embodied subject facing objects. And we have plenty of evidence that even our nearest primate kin are not fully developed embodied subjects. That is to say, they don't have a continuous sense of the self facing that which is explicitly other than themselves. So, for me, intentionality is something that is fully developed in humans. That is to say, I have a sense that there is something that my experiences are about, my thoughts are about, and so on. I have the feeling that other animals, other than humans, are much more dissolved, as it were, in their Umwelt than you and I are. I know, Michael, you're probably going to come back on this in a second.
Well, no, I just think you're probably being a bit unfair to some chimpanzees.
Well, except there's some very good work done on chimpanzees. I mean, there's Daniel Povenel in particular, looked at the chimpanzees' perception of objects, perception of causation, and perception of others. And essentially, chimpanzees appear to be essentially Barkelians. They don't write Barkelian philosophy, but as far as they're concerned, things exist only insofar as they're experiencing them. When I experience an object, I am aware of it transcending my experiences of it. They don't have a full developed theory of mind. So in that sense, there's apparently good evidence that they don't have a fully developed sense of an object. I can see the skepticism from this distance, and I would be very happy. May I sort of invite a return?
Yes, because it's so fantastic.
Well, I think there's, well, I rely on, as it were, not laboratory evidence, but evidence of, I mean, there seems to be a lot of, as it were, common sense evidence that animals recognize you, they are aware of you, and so forth. I mean, animals that know you well.
You can have discriminative behavior without any sense of that to which one responded being other than oneself, because there's very complex discriminative behavior in blue tits, lobsters, and so on.
It could be that a dog thinks that my dog, I don't have a dog.
No. You don't have a dog in this fight.
It's a philosophical dog.
Yes.
That my dog thinks I'm it, I mean part of it, as it were, or surely it thinks that it's faced with something in some sense other than itself. I mean, it's in, it's surrounded by things. And it has a practical knowledge of its environment to a degree. I mean, to an immensely lower degree. It's not thoughtful. It doesn't reflect on things and so forth like human beings. I agree with all that. And I agree that human life, a lot of the sorts of things that your neuromaniacs are studying are such complex social phenomena, so to speak, that there's something a bit balmy about what they are doing. But nevertheless, I think you're being unfair to animals. I think that's enough.
Well, of course, there's a famous paper called Unfair to Brutes, which is about whether or not brutes are thoughtless. And I think brutes are thoughtless. I mean, which doesn't mean to say they can't suffer and I don't love them.
Thank you. Perhaps I should begin by explaining that when I left the army at the age of 29, I went to work for a man who I later discovered, was a great-grandson of Charles Darwin. And that's important because I then learned that he and his family, a large family, regarded all religion as nonsense, simply nonsensical. And what I've been surprised by in your talk, Professor, is that you haven't actually mentioned the one thing which to me is so essential to the human mind, which is its sense of spirituality. Have you any comments to make about that, please?
I feel I have a very strong spiritual sense. I feel that I'm astonished and amazed at straightforward things, like that I'm aware of you as I'm standing here, which cannot be explained in terms that I can fully understand. So I have a sense of possibility, I have a sense of meanings that go beyond that which I can articulate or understand. I just don't, as it were, locate that spiritual sense within a particular set of beliefs. It's free-floating. Is that okay? No. I can see that. Yes, I'm doing very bad.
You've tried to reduce an enormous history of human behaviour, human activity, and also, of course, violence and cruelty, but nevertheless, an enormous history just for the relationship between you and me. That's not spirituality, or at least if it is, it's sort of one-dimensional. So again, spirituality has a temporal depth, which you're dismissing and sort of saying, well, I see you and you see me, so that's my spirituality. It's not enough. But forgive me if we say directly.
No. I'm very glad you said that, to clarify, because it just seems to be, all I'm saying is that I don't for a moment feel that the meaning and significance of the world is closed off by a set of ideas that I have. Andrew and I were talking at great length just earlier on, and I do feel there are a lot of ideas that have been, as it were, forgotten and lost in history. And much of the dialogue, say, between an atheist like myself and somebody who has religious belief like Andrew, will consist for me in exhuming ideas that have been forgotten and lost. So I don't, for a moment, believe that the present tense and the present is able to encompass all the things that people have thought and felt. And I think we would gain a lot from recovering those things.
Thank you.
But what I'm saying is, you don't have to look necessarily for very complex ideas to discover the spiritual dimension. Yeah.
You gentlemen at the back.
It's looking like 1-1 at the moment, and is that right? Is it? Yeah.
Thank you for the very provocative talk. So I have a lot of questions, but I'll try to limit myself to one point. So in response to the Libet experiments, you seem to be saying that the act, or the putative act in the experiment, is defined in terms of its response to a community of minds or to cultural practices in general. So it's defined as being part of a certain practice of experimenting and getting up and blah, 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 blah. But first of all, this seems to go strongly against our common sense notion of act. I mean, most people would not think that the act of raising your hand is constituted partially by this long extension, this accordion, if you will, of events or causes that are connected to it. But it seems that the claim is easily parodied. So we could say something like, well, it requires all these other people to recognize that my raising my hand is wanting to be called on and to ask a question. And that's partly because you're used to the practice of going to a seminar, or you're used to being at a university. And then it's part of being at the Ian Ramsey Center or being at Trinity, as opposed to being in Las Vegas, where we have a very different meaning perhaps. And then it seems that that's in terms of our previous generations have set up these norms. And then very quickly it sounds like my raising my hand goes all the way back as far, till apes communicated successfully. So I'm really confused about what your notion of action is and where the delineations come from.
I thought behind your question was the worry that I was replacing, as it were, material determinism by cultural determinism. Was that a slight worry behind that?
No.
No.
I'm just curious about what action means for you.
I mean, when it comes to the origin of an action, I would like to say that my actions are free if they meet 3 criteria. One is that I am, in some real sense, I am the origin of them. Secondly, that they express what I am, and not just a moment of me, but me in depth. And thirdly, if they deflect the course of events. Those are the 3 criteria for me of a free action. And it seems to me that we won't find those criteria fulfilled if we break down our actions into physical components. If you look at the person participating in Libet's experiment, it's clearly she is the origin of her actions, because all of the things that she's done wouldn't have happened in that sequence if she hadn't been, as it were, transilluminating them with her intentions and her meanings and so on. Secondly, that they do express quite a lot about her. She wants to help science and so on and so forth. And thirdly, clearly she's deflected the course of events by taking part in this in this experiment. She isn't as if she's arrived like a pebble falling to the ground. So I think looking for the freedom of her action when she moves her wrist, you've got to look for the freedom of the action of her participating in the experiment, which involves assenting to things and understanding so many things and so on. It doesn't mean to say that I have to look for the freedom of her action to some, I go further and further and further back. It's sufficient that it's an expression of a swathe of herself.
This is all very metaphorical. It's kind of hard for me to get a grip on. But
it's very accurate and phenomenological. It's not metaphorical. It's actually how things are in actions.
Well, I'll just pick on one of those
Yeah.
criteria. So it's deflection of events. It seems that anything is trivially deflection of some events. So even if it seems like putting my hand up is a pretty uncontroversially free action, but it seems like it wouldn't be on your account if it didn't deflect events. I mean, if they hadn't called on me, how would it have deflected?
What I'm saying is if you were, as it were, had no choice but to raise your action, it wouldn't be free. In other words, if you whatever happened, you were going to raise your hand, then it wouldn't be free. But as you're raising your hand now, you're making a very complex point, and that I think is expressing your good self, expressing a lot of things in you. I mean, and in that sense, it's free. Whereas if I applied an electrode to your brain and your hand started twitching, that would be quite a different matter altogether. That would have no relationship to your biography, to the thing that you've cultivated and driven yourself. Does that make sense? Sort of.
I'm not convinced, but I'll...
No? Let me take the difference between... I ran epilepsy clinics for many years. When patients had epileptic fits, the epileptic fits were just events that came across their lives. It had no relation to their biography. They just fell to the ground. When it came to them dealing with their seizures and talking to me about them, deciding whether to trust me and turning up to my clinic and deciding whether or not to tell their employers about it and deciding whether to take the tablets, that was where their freedom lay. And there was a complete contrast between having the seizure, which was a purely cerebral event, and dealing with their seizures, which is something profound and complexly human.
Andrew, and then Yusuf.
Thank you very much for a very stimulating, interesting lecture.
Thank you.
I want to probe a little bit at your understanding of science and the scope of science, not in any sort of hostile way at all. But as I hear you, you're arguing that, firstly, I suppose, are you arguing that there are limitations to Darwinism and neuroscience, or are you arguing that they are misapplied?
Mm-hmm.
And then, do you think that the features of human life, which you've been talking about in such an interesting way, lie beyond the scope of explanation as science is currently conceived? Or do you think that they just lie beyond the scope of science in general, and that some other form of human inquiry, humanistic inquiry perhaps, is required in order to understand them in an appropriate way?
Thank you. I mean, let me focus on sort of neuromania, and let us suppose there weren't the current constraints on our ability to look at neural activity, that we were able ultimately to do clever scans that gave us a clear and total account of activity in every single neuron in the brain in real life situations, like, for example, writing a novel, over a period of a year. What would we get out of that? What we get out is 1,000 billion ones and zeros. Neuron switched off, neuron switched on, neuron switched off, and so that's all we'd get. And that seems to me that, so in other words, even if we overcome the present limitations on imaging or detection of neural activity, I don't think we would actually get any closer to understanding what it's like to write a novel. So I think it is a principled limitation, not just a temporary limitation. Does that make sense?
Yes. So, is there an objection then to explanation as an all-embracing human explanatory, an all-embracing human project?
One type of explanation.
As a theologian, I definitely agree with that.
Well, yes. I mean, I think there's to narrow everything to one particular sort of explanation, I would entirely agree, but there are many other sorts of explanations, whether those explanations are complete or not. So, when we're trying to explain my writing a novel over a period of a year, it's obvious that a recording of all my brain activity over that year, however precise, will tell us absolutely nothing. Whether, however, there are other explanations, you might say he writes a novel because he wants to express certain feelings, he wants to bring things together, he gets a joy and narrative and so on and so forth. That is itself is at least some kind of explanation, but I don't think it's a complete explanation. So I think I'm a bit like you. I'm not too sure that anything is completely explained, but I don't actually then get a sort of theological payback, as it were, from the gaps in explanations.
I thought I was asking the questions.
I think it's the gentleman there. So first of all here, I think you were first. Yes.
Well, this follows on from the previous question, really. If you're so insistent that you're not identical to your brain and that you have intentionality, and that can't be explained even in principle by the workings of your brain, even if we develop perfect scanners and so on, how can you not be a dualist?
Well, because being a dualist is just as bankrupt as being a materialist. So I wouldn't want to exchange one lot of bankruptcy for another. That would be like, current economic policy. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm not a dualist, I'm not a panpsychist, I'm not a property dualist, I'm not a substance dualist, I'm an ontological agnostic. And what I'm looking for is some corking, fantastic idea from somebody, and it hasn't come yet. But like John Locke, all my job is to be a humble undergardener clearing the rubbish on the path to truth. I'm awaiting for the incomparable Mr. Newton, philosophical Mr. Newton, to help us to see things. At the moment, if you look at all the alternatives, they're just as bad. I've just focused on one that happens to be the dominant thing on offer, which is materialism. But as I say, neutral monism, property dualism, substance dualism, panpsychism, they're all rubbish. Hence, I'm an ontological agnostic. Yeah. But at least I have the Socratic wisdom of knowing that I don't know and nobody else does either.
Thank you so much for the talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I would sort of like to follow on from the previous two questions. So I'm a default student in neuroscience, and my work is completely unrelated. It's just an area of interest. But some of my colleagues that we sort of have these kind of discussions with all the time would argue very strongly for the ideas of neuromania. And so if I can just take you up on one of the points of the neural activity, the being on or off. I mean, that's quite an old idea. We now know that some neurons have a modulatory role with neurotransmitters that sort of spill over, and there's a lot of stuff has to do with the frequency, and I won't go into the details of that, but the point is that in neuroscience we are discovering more and more all the time. And so, as you said earlier, sort of making a reference to the age-old God of the gaps argument, where people used to say, well, we can't explain why the sun comes up on that side of the world and goes down on that side, so surely God does it. This sounds like there is a danger of saying we don't know quite how the brain works, and because of that, it means that the brain can't really explain different things. And so my question is, hypothetically speaking, if we were able to understand everything about the brain, how all the neurons work, would you convert to being a neuromaniac, or do you have some kind of metaphysical objection where, regardless of our understanding of the brain, you would always stand firm in saying that a person is not their brain?
I have no prior prejudice at all. And I'd love to be escaped from ontological agnosia because it's a bit dull in a sort of way. But it seems to me that, yes, I mean, you've referred to some notions. For example, if we're thinking about consciousness, we have to think about the brain acting as a whole, and we have to think about binding processes such as 40 hertz activity over a large quantity of brain and so on. But none of those kinds of things deliver anything that will take us across the gap between sodium ions going through flea-bitten membranes to human consciousness. So far.
So we don't know that any of those things deliver because we don't know everything about the brain yet. So my question is, hypothetically, if we, let's say we could explain it in terms of brain activity, which of course we can't, but there seems to be this increase of our understanding of the brain, explaining more and more about our behaviours, our emotions, and everything we do. We're not quite there yet, but hypothetically speaking, if we could, would you then go for that?
I think there's two questions there. One is, if the brain did explain consciousness, would the brain explain consciousness? And the answer is, sure, it would. But behind that is, are we pointing in the right direction? I think is what you're saying. And it seems to me that the way neuroscience is evolving, it's helped me enormously in my research on epilepsy and stroke, which deals with the necessary rather than sufficient conditions of consciousness, or necessary and sufficient conditions of voluntary movement and so on. But can I see anything in the current metaphysical framework of neuroscience that makes me optimistic that we shall be able to understand human consciousness and so on in terms of brain activity? The answer is no. But do I rule out the remote possibility? And the answer is not yet. I'm genuine ontological agnostic. But I suppose what I take objection to is those who say, we now know the brain is going to be the answer to consciousness. And there are so many assertions that are made that have absolutely no empirical basis or appropriate metaphysical framework. So that's where I'm at. I mean, if somebody comes with a corking idea I never thought of, it's completely transform it. Give me a corking idea. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
With regard to those sorts of ideas, I wonder whether what you think of the work of Rupert Sheldrake, what he's outlined in the Science Delusion and the other theories, which I'm sure you know much more about. I come from this from a layman's point of view.
Yeah.
I have no expertise in it. But I just wondered what you thought of his ideas and whether these might support what you're suggesting in the way of new approach.
I agree with Rupert on some of his negative assertions. For example, that there isn't any neurological explanation of memory, that there are, in fact, talking about intentionality, I think these are things he would entirely agree with. Where I disagree with him is he then actually makes some positive assertions, which I think there is as little empirical basis as you could imagine. So I think he's right to blow the whistle on the claim that we understand things that we don't, but I don't agree with his, to me, unsupported positive assertions. For example, that memory is to be explained by morphic resonance between the brain and memories hanging out in, out there in the air and so on and so forth. So I think he's put his finger on the hubris of a lot of science, but then he's brought a bit of hubris of his own to fill the gaps. I like him a lot personally. In fact, he and I were on a panel 2 days ago. So this is not, and he will have heard me say, we said that, I mean, so I've said it behind his back and in front of his back, so he can feel the sense of being stared at. Yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to pick up on some evidence, and you can either call it supernatural or you can call it natural. The first is 32 years ago, an article was published in Science by a man called Lauber, I understand, who was at Sheffield at the time, who was looking into patients with hydrocephalus.
Yeah.
And
he's a paediatrician, wasn't he, at Sheffield?
That's
yeah.
it. So he was examining children in particular, yes, with the scanning technology of the time, and found one young man who had an IQ of 126 and a mathematics degree, and 95% of his brain was cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so there was about 5% which we would call cortex and therefore working brain.
Yeah.
How do we explain that? He was very disappointed that no one actually tried to go into his research, having published this himself, and tried to provoke people to do it by saying, so what good is a brain and what good is a brain if actually, if you can think and get a mathematics degree without having a functioning brain. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, what do you make of all the out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences, very well documented now, years and years of it, where people can be actually timed in terms of where they were and where their bodies were, and the fact that there's absolutely no circulation in the brain at all. And yet they had not just awareness, but hyper-awareness.
Yeah.
And were able to describe things in great detail, as, for example, being on the operating table, and things which they couldn't have seen because their eyes were taped shut, they were under anaesthesia, etc. What do you make of that, and where does that fit in the pattern?
I was taking Lauber's observations. I think they're absolutely fascinating. There have been more cases since then that show people got the merest buttering of cortex over a huge, essentially, hydrocephalus, who have been very successful. And I think that just demonstrates how the current neophrenology, where you relate modules of human capacities to bits of the brain, I think it is phrenology. And I think what Lauber observed, no wonder it was unpopular, because it didn't fall in the current paradigm. So, and I think he was an extraordinary man, actually, in many other ways. As for near-death experiences, I mean, there's been a lot of work to attempt to look at this empirically. In particular, you're probably aware of the experiments where they put markers on the ceiling of resus rooms to see whether people can remember those things. And so far, the results have been quite disappointing. So their recall of out-of-body experiences may be like our own recall when we wake up of our dreams. It's a way of reconstructing things that happen. The waking mind reconstructs what happens as we return to normal consciousness. So I suppose that's a slightly dull, naturalistic explanation. And perhaps that shows my prejudices.
I'm afraid those naturalistic explanations are just simply incorrect. If you look at the evidence, this has been argued over hundreds.
I actually reviewed the original paper for the Lancet. It was published in 1992, so I'm certainly familiar with the evidence. But I mean, I think so far the empirical evidence isn't good enough to make me want to, as it were, do a sort of metaphysical somersault. But having said that, I think this is an open area, and one just doesn't know. But I'm a remaining agnostic. Is that all right?
Fair enough.
Thank you.
So, just one more question, and then we'll have to call it a horse.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, would the neuromania you're describing be enough to explain animal behaviour, and whatever we can pick up from them? And also, I have to look up the references, but I believe some anthropologists have pointed out that some humans don't seem to have much of a subject-object split either, certainly in certain tribes and so on. So would you still classify them as human?
I'm not too sure how the anthropologists could come to those conclusions. They may not express it in things those anthropologists can understand, but after all, those particular cultures are being refracted to the anthropologist's brain, and I'd be very surprised if, as it were, the folk metaphysics of the groups that the anthropologists observe is utterly profoundly different from ours, particularly as in those cultures they describe, they still have complex, very, very complex cultures, which is seen to be based on a community of minds and on a sense of objects other than ourselves and so on. When it comes to animals, I have a huge problem. I mean, although when I was responding to Michael's question, I was being sort of very bullish about we human beings and the difference between us, I'm not too sure exactly how to deal with animal consciousness, because I can't even make up my mind whether this is a metaphysical question or an empirical question, or a metaphysical question or an empirical question that requires the right metaphysical framework. So as for animals, I'm in a total mess. I can't even say, which animals are sentient or not. I mean, what is my attitude to ants? I stamp on them in rage as appropriate, but I'm not too sure that how guilty I should feel about that. So the answer is, I think the animal question is a good one. One thing I do feel is that we don't currently have the evidence to feel that animals have propositional attitudes, beliefs, and so on. But beyond that, your guess is better than mine, probably. Yeah. Yeah.
I'd love to go on, but I think we'd better call it a halt. But what I do recommend, I'd love to go on, but I think we'd better call it a halt. But what I do recommend is that you want to stay behind for a few minutes and put your questions privately. Would that be all right?
Of course, absolutely, yes.
Very
Thank
good.
you.
Well, just before we finish, I'll just give a final plug for the next Ian Ramsey Centre seminar, which is 24th of January. We actually have a string of 4 professors next term. Rather good. I was starting with Professor John Henry Brooke, who was once very much involved with the Ian Ramsey Centre. He'll be coming back here on the 24th of January, title to be announced. So hopefully see you next year. And would you, just to conclude this summer, would you join me in thanking Professor Raymond Tallis?